Book 2, Chapters 6 and 7 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 2, Chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6. The Jews greatly complain of Archelaus and desire that they may be made subject to Roman governors. But when Caesar had heard what they had to say, he distributed Herod's dominions among his sons, according to his own pleasure. But now came another accusation from the Jews against Archelaus at Rome, which he was to answer to. It was made by those ambassadors who, before the revolt, had come, by Varus's permission, to plead for the liberty of their country. Those that came were 50 in number, but there were more than 8,000 of the Jews at Rome who supported them. And when Caesar had assembled a council of the principal Romans in Apollo's temple, that was in the palace, this was what he had himself built and adorned, at a vast expense. This holding a council in the temple of Apollo, in the emperor's palace at Rome, by Augustus, and even the building of this temple magnificently by himself in that palace, are exactly agreeable to Augustus, in his elder years, as Aldrich, and from Suetonius and Propertius. The multitude of the Jews stood with the ambassadors, and on the other side stood Archelaus with his friends. But as for the kindred of Archelaus, they stood on neither side, for to stand on Archelaus's side, their hatred to him and envy at him would not give them leave, while yet they were afraid to be seen by Caesar with his accusers. Besides these, there were present Archelaus's brother Philip, being sent thither beforehand out of kindness by Varus, for 2 reasons. The one was this, that he might be assisting to Archelaus, and the other was this, that in case Caesar should make a distribution of what Herod possessed among his posterity, he might obtain some share of it. And now, upon the permission that was given the accusers to speak, they in the first place went over Herod's breaches of their law, and said that he was not a king, but the most barbarous of all tyrants, and that they had found him to be such by the sufferings they underwent from him, that when a very great number had been slain by him, those that were left had endured such miseries, as they called those that were dead happy men; that he had not only tortured the bodies of his subjects, but entire cities, and had done much harm to the cities of his own country, while he adorned those that belonged to foreigners; and he shed the blood of Jews, in order to do kindnesses to those people that were out of their bounds; that he had filled the nation full of poverty, and of the greatest iniquity, instead of that happiness and those laws which they had anciently enjoyed; that, in short, the Jews had borne more calamities from Herod, in a few years, than had their forefathers during all that interval of time that had passed since they had come out of Babylon, and returned home, in the reign of Xerxes. Here we have a strong confirmation that it was Xerxes, and not Artaxerxes, under whom the main part of the Jews returned out of the Babylonian captivity, i.e., in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. The same thing is in the Antiquities. That, however, the nation was come to so low a condition, by being inured to hardships, that they submitted to his successor of their own accord, though he brought them into bitter slavery; that accordingly they readily called Archelaus, though he was the son of so great a tyrant, king, after the decease of his father, and joined with him in mourning for the death of Herod, and wishing him good success in that his succession, while yet this Archelaus, lest he should be in danger of not being thought the genuine son of Herod, began his reign with the murder of 3,000 citizens, as if he had a mind to offer so many bloody sacrifices to God for his government, and to fill the temple with the like number of dead bodies at that festival; that, however, those that were left after so many miseries had just reason to consider now at last the calamities they had undergone, and to oppose themselves, like soldiers in war, to receive those stripes upon their faces, but not upon their backs as hitherto. Whereupon they prayed that the Romans would have compassion upon the poor remains of Judea, and not expose what was left of them to such as barbarously tore them to pieces, and that they would join their country to Syria, and administer the government by their own commanders, whereby it would soon be demonstrated that those who are now under the calumny of seditious persons and lovers of war know how to bear governors that are set over them, if they be but tolerable ones. So the Jews concluded their accusations with this request. Then rose up Nicolaus, and confuted the accusations which were brought against the kings, and himself accused the Jewish nation, as hard to be ruled, and as naturally disobedient to kings. He also reproached all those kinsmen of Archelaus who had left him, and were gone over to his accusers. So Caesar, after he had heard both sides, dissolved the assembly for that time. But a few days afterward, he gave the one half of Herod's kingdom to Archelaus, by the name of Ethnarch, and promised to make him king also afterward, if he rendered himself worthy of that dignity. But as to the other half, he divided it into 2 tetrarchies, and gave them to 2 other sons of Herod, the one of them to Philip, and the other to that Antipas who contested the kingdom with Archelaus. Under this last was Perea and Galilee, with a revenue of 200 talents. But Batanea, and Trachonitis, and Auranitis, and certain parts of Zeno's house about Jamnia, with a revenue of 100 talents, were made subject to Philip; while Idumea, and all Judea, and Samaria, were parts of the ethnarchy of Archelaus, although Samaria was eased of 1/4 of its taxes, out of regard to their not having revolted with the rest of the nation. He also made subject to him the following cities, viz. Stratos Tower, and Sebasta, and Joppa, and Jerusalem; but as to the Grecian cities, Gaza, and Gadara, and Hippos, he cut them off from the kingdom, and added them to Syria. Now the revenue of the country that was given to Archelaus was 400 talents. Salome also, besides what the king had left her in his testaments, was now made mistress of Jamnia, and Ashdod, and Phasaelis. Caesar did moreover bestow upon her the royal palace of Ascalon, by all which she got together a revenue of 60 talents, but he put her house under the ethnarchy of Archelaus. And for the rest of Herod's offspring, they received what was bequeathed to them in his testaments; but besides that, Caesar granted to Herod's 2 virgin daughters 500,000 drachmae of silver, and gave them in marriage to the sons of Pheroras. But after this family distribution, he gave between them what had been bequeathed to him by Herod, which was 1,000 talents, reserving to himself only some inconsiderable presents, in honor of the deceased. Chapter 7. The history of the spurious Alexander. Archelaus is banished, and Glaphyra dies, after what was to happen to both of them had been showed them in their dreams. In the meantime there was a man, who was by birth a Jew, but brought up at Sidon with one of the Roman freedmen, who falsely pretended, on account of the resemblance of their countenances, that he was that Alexander who was slain by Herod. This man came to Rome, in hopes of not being detected. He had one who was his assistant, of his own nation, and who knew all the affairs of the kingdom, and instructed him how to say those that were sent to kill him and Aristobulus had pity upon them, and stole them away, by putting bodies that were like theirs in their places. This man deceived the Jews that were at Crete, and got a great deal of money of them for travelling in splendor, and thence sailed to Melos, where he was thought so certainly genuine that he got a great deal more money, and prevailed with those that had treated him to sail along with him to Rome. So he landed at Dicearchia Puteoli, and got very large presents from the Jews who dwelt there, and was conducted by his father's friends as if he were a king; nay, the resemblance in his countenance procured him so much credit, that those who had seen Alexander, and had known him very well, would take their oaths that he was the very same person. Accordingly, the whole body of the Jews that were in Rome ran out in crowds to see him, and an innumerable multitude there was which stood in the narrow places through which he was carried, for those of Melos were so far distracted that they carried him in a sedan, and maintained a royal attendance for him at their own proper charges. But Caesar, who knew perfectly well the lineaments of Alexander's face, because he had been accused by Herod before him, discerned the fallacy in his countenance, even before he saw the man. However, he suffered the agreeable fame that went of him to have some weight with him, and sent Celadus, one who well knew Alexander, and ordered him to bring the young man to him. But when Caesar saw him, he immediately discerned a difference in his countenance, and when he had discovered that his whole body was of a more robust texture, and like that of a slave, he understood the whole was a contrivance. But the impudence of what he said greatly provoked him to be angry at him, for when he was asked about Aristobulus, he said that he was also preserved alive, and was left on purpose in Cyprus, for fear of treachery, because it would be harder for plotters to get them both into their power while they were separate. Then did Caesar take him by himself privately, and said to him, I will give thee thy life if thou wilt discover who it was that persuaded thee to forge such stories. So he said that he would discover him, and followed Caesar, and pointed to that Jew who had abused the resemblance of his face to get money, for that he had received more presents in every city than ever Alexander did when he was alive. Caesar laughed at the contrivance, and put this spurious Alexander among his rowers on account of the strength of his body, but ordered him that persuaded him to be put to death. But for the people of Melos, they had been sufficiently punished for their folly by the expenses that they had been on his account. And now Archelaus took possession of his ethnarchy, and used not the Jews only, but the Samaritans also, barbarously, and this out of his resentment of their old quarrels with him. Whereupon they both of them sent ambassadors against him to Caesar, and in the 9th year of his government he was banished to Vienna, a city of Gaul, and his effects were put into Caesar's treasury. But the report goes, that before he was sent for by Caesar, he seemed to see 9 ears of corn, full and large, but devoured by oxen. When therefore he had sent for the diviners, and some of the Chaldeans, and inquired of them what they thought it portended, and when one of them had one interpretation, and another had another, Simon, one of the sect of Essens, said that he thought the ears of corn denoted years, and the oxen denoted a mutation of things, because by their ploughing they made an alteration of the country. That therefore he should reign as many years as there were ears of corn, and after he had passed through various alterations of fortune, should die. Now 5 days after Archelaus had heard this interpretation, he was called to his trial. I cannot also but think it would be worthy to be recorded what dream Glaphyra, the daughter of Archelaus, king of Cappadocia, had, who had at first been wife to Alexander, who was the brother of Archelaus, concerning whom we have been discoursing. This Alexander was the son of Herod the king, by whom he was put to death, as we have already related. This Glaphyra was married, after his death, to Juba, king of Libya, and after his death was returned home, and lived like a widow with her father. Then it was that Archelaus the ethnarch saw her, and fell so deeply in love with her, that he divorced Mariamne, who was then his wife, and married her. When therefore she was come into Judea, and had been there for a little while, she thought she saw Alexander stand by her, and that he said to her, Thy marriage with the king of Libya might have been sufficient for thee, but thou wast not contented with him, but art returned again to my family, to a third husband, and him, thou impudent woman, hast thou chosen for thine husband, who is my brother. However, I shall not overlook the injury thou hast offered me. I shall soon have thee again, whether thou wilt or no. Now Glaphyra hardly survived the narration of this dream of hers 2 days. End of Book 2, Chapters 6 and 7.